will now address the first question that we're going to pose to them, which is, what is the problem of mass incarceration? If it's true that a society can be judged by its prisons, what does the U.S. prison system say about the U.S. society?
Mass incarceration. Perhaps I'll begin by saying that many, many years ago, over 40 years ago, when I was in jail myself for being involved in campaigns to free political prisoners, George Jackson, the Soledad Brothers, the members of the Black Panther Party, Lolita LeBron and the Puerto Rican Nationalists, Los Siete de la Raza. Many of us began to realize that it was not simply a question of political repression, but it was not simply a question of political repression directed against specific individuals, but the entire institution of the prison was an institution of repression, fueled by racism. And therefore, while we called for the freedom of political prisoners, we began to recognize that we had to challenge the institutionalization of racism and violence through the prison system. Now, as I think Asha said earlier, at that time, there was something like 200,000 people in prison. And I can remember very distinctly feeling that this was such a huge mass of people. We could have talked about mass incarceration then, and there were 200,000 people behind bars. And incidentally, there are currently about 200,000 people in prison in India, which is about to be the most populous country in the world, and people are talking about mass incarceration in India. So that when we speak about 2.5 million people in the country's jails and prisons, we know we have a serious issue. Now, let me move on very quickly to say, I just want to make a couple of points here. I think the development of this phenomenon we've come to call the prison industrial complex has a great deal to do with global capitalism, has a great deal to do with the rise of globalization in the 1980s. This is the period when you begin to see institutions that address issues of social services. You begin to see education deteriorating. You begin to see the whole welfare system falling apart. And as a matter of fact, only that which is profitable begins to matter. Not people, but profits. And therefore, people who have problems of a lack of education, a lack of housing, no jobs, and so forth, begin to be treated as superfluous, as not belonging to this new globalization-inspired economy. And therefore, you put them in prison, and in the process, you get rid of the problems they supposedly have. You hide the problems of poverty by incarcerating people. And in the process, of course, you create another profitable enterprise. You create a profitable prison industrial complex. Now, let me just say very briefly that we know that this whole process is fueled by racism. And I'm sure that Michelle's going to talk about the part played by racism in producing this phenomenon of mass incarceration. I also think it's important to point out that one of the fastest growing sectors of the prison complex is the immigrant detention facility.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
And perhaps we'll have an opportunity to talk about this later on, but we should be aware of the fact that the U.S. has provided the model for the uses of incarceration all over the world. The prison has become a marketable commodity that is devouring the lives of people, especially in the global south, but literally all over the world. And finally, it's not only a question of considering the impact of mass incarceration on people who are in prison, but the uses of carceral technologies on people in the so-called free world. And the best example one can see of that is in occupied Palestine and the role that Israel plays, funded by the U.S., in producing what you can call the largest open-air prison in the world. Thank you.
Well, it's almost enough said. I have to say, that I first heard Angela speak about the emergence of this prison industrial complex decades ago, when I myself was still quite asleep to what was happening around me. I was in law school at the time, and I went to hear Angela speak at a high school in Monterey, California, in a gymnasium that was packed. And at the time, I was aspiring to be a public defender, and I thought, as I was graduating from law school, that I knew quite a bit about the criminal justice system. I had interned in a public defender office, and I thought I knew what was going on. And I heard Angela speak about there being writing on the wall of what was to come, and that if we continue the rate of incarceration, that we could have millions of people behind bars. And I remember shaking my head and thinking, millions? I know the system is bad, but... And then I went on and worked in public defender offices, worked as a civil rights attorney, working in communities hard hit by mass incarceration. And it took a series of experiences for the light bulb to finally go on for me. And like Skip Gates, I realized Angela was right. Our system of mass incarceration is truly the most pressing racial justice issue of our time. It is the vehicle through which the clock It's the vehicle through which the clock on racial progress has literally been turned back. It is the retaliation against communities of color for the progress gained in the civil rights movement and in the Black Power movement. It is a backlash that we are experiencing, a political backlash that gained in steam at precisely the moment that the changes in global capitalism were wreaking havoc on inner city communities nationwide. As the Reagan Revolution gained steam, urban areas across America were experiencing sudden, drastic joblessness. Jobs just vanished from these communities. Factories closed down, moved overseas. Technological innovations rendered hundreds of thousands of people now useless in this new global economy. And we had a choice in that moment about how to respond to hundreds of thousands of people locked in segregated communities, people who had depended on factory jobs for their survival. We had a choice in that moment about how to respond. We could continue down the road that so many freedom fighters and racial justice advocates had been traveling, a road towards inclusion and justice. We could go down that road, or we could go down another road, a road more familiar when it comes to matters of race, the road of exclusion, punitiveness, oppression, and despair. And we chose the latter road. Mass incarceration is not only payback for the civil rights movement, but it reflects a fundamental choice that has been made about how we as a nation will define ourselves in this era of global capitalism. Who the winners and losers will be, how they will be defined, and how those at the bottom will be dealt with, and the message it will send to the rest of us. So when people ask me why I believe that mass incarceration is the most pressing racial justice issue of our time, I say there is no path to racial justice that includes this system of control. No path. So if we are going to work for racial justice, we must work to end mass incarceration. Now, what does that mean? In my view, that doesn't mean just closing prisons, although that is a big part of it, and we must begin with Attica. We also have to recognize that the system of mass incarceration isn't just about who's in jail or who's in prison, but it's about all those on the outside who are doing time on the outside, who are on probation and on parole, people who are saddled with felony records and must check the box for the rest of their lives. People who are denied housing, access to basic public benefits, denied access to education because they've been branded a felon, branded a criminal. It is this entire caste-like system that's been created that must be undone. Today, of the 7.5 million people who are under correctional control today, less than 2 million of those people are actually in prison. All the rest of them are on jail or probation or on parole, firmly within the grip of this system, but not physically behind prison walls. So when we talk about ending mass incarceration, I hope we commit ourselves to dismantling this entire caste-like system and build a movement on behalf of those who are doing time on the inside as well as those on the outside. You guys are amazing.